When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the war quickly became something far darker than a conventional military campaign. Behind the advancing German army followed special mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen, literally deployment groups. Their mission was simple but horrifying: to eliminate Jews, communists, Roma, political prisoners, and anyone else deemed an enemy of the Reich. Between 1941 and 1943, these units carried out one of the most brutal campaigns of mass murder in history. They killed over 1.5 million people, mostly by mass shootings, long before the gas chambers of Auschwitz or Treblinka were built. To understand how an Einsatzgruppen execution worked is to understand how bureaucratic planning, ideology, and human cruelty combined to industrialise killing in the open air. The Einsatzgruppen were organised by Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA, and one of the architects of the Holocaust. Each group was composed of men from the SS, Gestapo, Security Police, the SIPO, and SD, the Security Service. When the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, began on the 22nd of June 1941, 4 main Einsatzgruppen were formed. Einsatzgruppe A, operating in the Baltic states, as in Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia; Einsatzgruppe B, covering Belarus; Einsatzgruppe C, working in northern and central Ukraine; Einsatzgruppe D, in southern Ukraine, the Crimea and the Caucasus. Each group was made up of around 500 to 1,000 men, and was divided into smaller Einsatzkommandos and Sonderkommandos, or special detachments. They followed closely behind the Wehrmacht, entering towns and villages shortly after the front line had moved forward. Their orders were vague at first: eliminate potential enemies, but in practice this meant the systematic extermination of Jews, especially adult men at first, then women, children, and the elderly, as Nazi policy hardened. Once a town or village was occupied, the process began with the identification of local Jews and other targets. Einsatzgruppen officers often worked with local collaborators, such as Lithuanian, Ukrainian or Latvian police units, who provided names, addresses and lists of community leaders. In some cases, German troops or local authorities simply announced that all Jews must report to a specific location for registration or resettlement. In many towns, Jews were forced to wear armbands marked with the Star of David and were confined to temporary ghettos or holding areas. Rumours quickly spread about the fate that awaited them, but few could believe that an entire population would simply be executed in cold blood. Before each killing operation, the commander of the local Einsatzkommando received orders from the higher up the chain, often passed down from the RSHA or from local SS and police leaders. The next steps were logistical and methodical. Firstly, they selected the site. The unit would find a secluded place near the town, a ravine, sandpit, forest clearing or an old anti-tank ditch. The site had to be hidden from view, but close enough to transport hundreds or thousands of people. Famous examples include Babi Yar ravine near Kiev, Panari forest near Vilnius, or Rumbula forest near Riga. Then the digging of the pits began. Either local forced labourers, Soviet POWs, or the victims themselves were made to dig large trenches. These could be dozens of metres long and several metres deep. In some cases, pre-existing ravines were used. Then ammunition and vehicles would be gathered. Trucks brought in ammunition, fuel and food for the men. Some units even brought cameras, as officers often photographed or filmed the massacres. Then they would coordinate with local police. The Wehrmacht and local auxiliary police often guarded roads, rounded up victims, or maintained order, ensuring the killings could proceed without resistance or witnesses escaping. On the day of the execution, the victims were ordered to gather. Announcements might be made claiming the Jews were to be resettled to the east or sent to work camps. People were told to bring identification papers, valuables and warm clothing. Some were even instructed to bring shovels. In smaller towns, the process was more brutal. Armed soldiers and police simply dragged people from their homes at dawn. Families were herded into marketplaces, synagogues or town squares. The victims were often forced to hand over their valuables, including gold, jewellery and wedding rings. In some cases, women were stripped of their coats or boots before being marched away. German soldiers, policemen and local collaborators looted the belongings after the killings. The journey to the execution site was one of the most terrifying stages. Victims were marched in columns, sometimes hundreds or thousands at a time, guarded by armed men with dogs. Those who collapsed or tried to flee were shot immediately. Eyewitnesses later recalled the eerie silence of these marches. Some people prayed, others held their children or tried to comfort the elderly. In Ukraine, many villagers remembered the sound of machine guns echoing through the forests long after the columns disappeared from sight. At places like Babi Yar, over 33,000 Jews from Kiev were marched over 2 days, the 29th and 30th of September 1941, to the ravine on the city's edge, and very few returned. The actual killing process was horrifyingly systematic and shockingly efficient. There were 2 main methods used by the Einsatzgruppen. Firstly, the sardine packing method, the sardine packen. This technique, devised by Friedrich Jeckeln, the higher SS and police leader in the Baltic region, was used in many large-scale massacres. The victims were brought to the edge of the pit in small groups. They were ordered to strip naked and hand over any remaining valuables. They were then forced to lie down in the pit or ravine. Shooters, usually SS men or police, stood above and shot each person in the back of the head or neck with pistols or rifles. New groups were then made to lie on top of the dead bodies, layer upon layer, until the pit was full. The term sardine packing came from the way the corpses were stacked tightly, like sardines in a tin. It was intended to save space and bullets. The second method was the line or group shooting method. In smaller operations or when pits were shallow, victims were lined up along the edge of a trench or ditch. Firing squads shot them so their bodies fell directly in the grave. The next group was brought forward and the process repeated. Sometimes to save ammunition, the Einsatzgruppen used submachine guns such as MP40s or Mauser rifles with single precise shots. Shooters were trained to aim for the base of the skull for an instant kill. The men of the Einsatzgruppen were not all hardened SS veterans. Many were educated men, lawyers, teachers and professionals. Their average age was around 30. Most were indoctrinated with Nazi ideology and had volunteered for service, believing they were fighting Bolshevism or Jewish influence. But many still struggled with the psychological toll of the killing. Reports survive of drunkenness, breakdowns, and even deaths by their own hands amongst the shooters. Commanders like Heinrich Himmler were aware of this. At one massacre in Minsk, Himmler reportedly turned pale and almost fainted when he witnessed an execution up close. Still, the killing continued. Officers encouraged their men to drink heavily afterwards, to relax after the shooting. Victims' belongings, watches, wallets, jewellery were sometimes distributed amongst the men as rewards. Once the killing was done, the pits were filled in. In some places the ground moved for days as trapped victims tried to escape or as gases escaped from decomposing bodies. To cover the evidence, Einsatzgruppen units would plant trees over the sites or have local peasants smooth out the earth. As the war turned against Germany in 1943-44, Operation 1005 was launched to exhume and burn the bodies to hide the crimes. Jewish prisoners called Sonderkommando 1005 were forced to dig up the corpses and cremate them on pyres made of railway tracks and fuel. Afterwards, those prisoners were also killed. While Jews made up the vast majority of the victims, Einsatzgruppen also executed Roma gypsies, communist officials, partisans, psychiatric patients and intellectuals. Entire Jewish communities, some which had existed for centuries, were wiped out in days. In the Baltic states, over 90% of Jews were killed by the end of 1942. The massacre of Babi Yar remains the most infamous. 33,771 Jews were murdered over 2 days, but there were hundreds of other killing sites: Panari, where 70,000 were killed, Rumbula, where 25,000 were killed, Kamenets, Podolsk, 23,000 were killed, and Mizosh, where 1,700 were killed, each one a graveyard without tombstones. The Einsatzgruppen's crimes were not completely hidden. Some German soldiers took photographs and even compiled albums showing the shootings. These images of naked men, women and children kneeling before pits became crucial evidence after the war. Local villagers often heard or saw what happened. Some left accounts describing blood-soaked earth, the cries of children and gunfire echoing for hours. A few courageous people risked their lives to shelter or hide Jews, but in most occupied territories, the terror was so overwhelming the resistance was nearly impossible. What makes the Einsatzgruppen killings particularly chilling is their bureaucratic precision. Daily reports, operational situational reports, were sent to Berlin recording how many people were killed. These reports used cold administrative language. In Schlockov, 627 Jews executed. In Minsk, 1,200 partisans and Jews liquidated. The victims became numbers in a spreadsheet of extermination. This paperwork, preserved after the war, revealed that the Einsatzgruppen alone killed over 1.3 million people by early 1943, a staggering total achieved before the death camps reached full operation. By 1943, as the Red Army advanced, the Einsatzgruppen retreated westwards. Many of their commanders returned to Germany or took up posts in concentration camps. After the war, their crimes were investigated at the Nuremberg trials, specifically in the Einsatzgruppen trial. Of the 24 defendants, 14 were sentenced to death, though only 4 were actually executed. Others received prison terms or were released early during the 1950s. One of the most infamous, Otto Erlendorf, commander of Einsatzgruppen D, admitted to killing over 90,000 people and justified it as necessary to eliminate the threat of Bolshevism. He was hanged in 1951. The massacre sites of the Einsatzgruppen remain some of the most haunting places in Eastern Europe today. Many were forgotten during the Soviet era, when Jewish suffering was not specifically commemorated. Since the 1990s, memorials have been built at Babi Yar, Panari and Rumbula, often funded by Jewish communities and historians determined to remember those lost. Unlike the mechanised murder of the gas chambers, the Einsatzgruppen killings were intimate. Victims and killers saw each other's faces. Children clung to parents. Shooters saw the eyes of those who they killed. As one survivor of a Ukrainian massacre later said, "They looked at us as if we weren't human, but we were human until the last moment." The Einsatzgruppen represented the first most direct stage of the Holocaust, mass murder by bullets. Their actions transformed Nazi anti-Semitism from persecution to extermination. Without gas chambers or crematoria, they managed to kill over 1 million people in forests, ravines and fields, one bullet at a time. These were not spontaneous atrocities, but organised, methodical executions, carried out with chilling efficiency by men who saw themselves as dutiful soldiers. The Einsatzgruppen showed that genocide did not need factories of death. It only required ideology, obedience, and a willingness to dehumanise. Their crimes stand as a grim warning of what can happen when ordinary men are taught to believe that killing others is not just acceptable, but necessary. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.